President, and I thank Senator Nampijinpa Price for bringing on her private senator's bill, but also Mr Acting Deputy President for expressing her own experiences with her families in Central Australia. And I do think it's important that the Senate hears those stories, Mr Acting Deputy President, and I guess in a lot of respects First Nations people across the country have stories of such experiences to share. Mine began when we wanted to put in place in Borroloola a call for an alcohol management plan when I was in my 20s. And I remember trying to call a meeting of all our different language groups with the Yanyuwa, Garwa, Mara and Gurangi peoples, and how the women, my aunties, my grandmothers, we called the meeting because we wanted the alcohol to stop. And we wanted the destruction of what we could see happening for our children to stop. And so we had that meeting, and it went well, and people agreed. We talked about it on local media to see if there were changes in our community and if we could have those changes. But the next night, when alcohol did begin to flow again, we got eaten alive. And there was no doubt the abuse that we experienced is one that I've never forgotten. And so the alcohol didn't stop, but the abuse continued, and certainly the retribution in terms of wanting to stand strong against it continued. I spent the next 10 years looking after my mother after the domestic violence she experienced from her then partner, before she then went on to renal failure and kidney disease. And then I took on my sister's children, her 4 children, because of the domestic violence and the alcohol issues she was facing. I remember receiving the phone call in Alice Springs to leave what I was then doing, working with the ABC. And I went back to Darwin to take those children and to look after my sister who needed time to recover. And those kids were aged from 18 months to 10, 11 years of age. And I took them on. And at the time I was reading in Darwin for the ABC News, 6 a.m. in the mornings, getting up at 5, getting the kids up, getting someone to help me get them to school, as well as my own 2 children, and making sure those children would know that there was a better way, that alcohol wasn't the way and domestic violence wasn't the way. And so I'd leave my car with a neighbour so that that neighbour could then drive the 6 children to school when I was reading the 7:45 news on ABC radio, and the kids would ring me from the car when I got off air. I'd catch the bus or the taxi in on the mornings because it was early mornings at 5 a.m. And at about 8:15, I'd talk to the kids on their way to school, and I'd finish around 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and then I'd go get the car, catch the bus to my neighbours, pick up the car, and then I'd go and pick up the kids when they finished at school and take them home, pick up my mother and my sister and cook dinner for everyone. And then I just fell into bed to get up again at 5 a.m. the next morning and do it all again. But you know, that's what you do because you know that alcohol is a scourge, and you also know that domestic violence was rife. But I still had a job as well to try and put food on the table, to care for the kids. So we all have our stories. And then my aunties, who was smashed to smithereens by her partner with alcohol. We stood by her bed for the next 6 months as she lay unconscious, being told that she was never going to come to life again. But as a family, we stood around that bed, just holding her hands, massaging her legs while she laid in ICU. And I firmly believed she was going to come through, no matter what the doctors said. She and I were born at the same time. She was only a few days older than me. But I was determined to stand by that bed and make sure she got through. And you know what? She did. And today, she lives in Borroloola with no feet. They had to be amputated. Her elbow, she can't move because of the fractures from what she received from the hits. And her left arm is okay, but it's not that good, but it's better than her right arm. But, you know, we talk every day and I'm incredibly grateful that she survived. And then we work with her children because her daughter's gone through domestic violence too. And her daughter's daughter has now been relocated with a good family, living somewhere else, just so that she has a chance. My other sister, cousin sister, she struggled with alcohol that her 6 kids have been taken off her. I've taken 3 of the children, so we're raising 8-year-old and 9-year-old twins just because we know they need a bed, to be fed, to be loved, so that they have a good education and knowing that they have access to a good school. And so they live with us. And when I fly away, my husband looks after them. And he's a school teacher and he tries his best to look after those 3 children. And sometimes my auntie comes up from Borroloola on the bus, on the bush bus, just to help him when I'm down here in Canberra. So I know only too well, just like many First Nations people, that we look after our families and we care for them. It does not lessen, however, the importance of process and the importance of governments and the responsibility of governments and oppositions when it comes to policy making. And whilst this private Senator's bill has been brought forward by my fellow colleague from the Northern Territory, I have to say to the Senate that the Northern Territory government is doing what we expect it to do. And I have to say to the Senate that there has been enormous pressure applied to ensure that the Northern Territory government does what we know they are capable of doing within the Northern Territory Legislative Assembly, and that is to make the amendments that are required. Did they do it too late? Have they been real slow? Well, I think we can all answer that. But they're doing it. They're doing it. It's going to be there. Those bans we want, they're going to be in place on Wednesday, right across every area of the Northern Territory that we're talking about. The difference here, Senators, is that we've also, as members of government, had to look at this extremely closely in light of the history of the Northern Territory intervention and the sense of disempowerment that also occurred across the Northern Territory. And I do hear what my colleague's saying about those concerns around the town camps, but there are other things, Senators, you also need to know about that people had concerns about regarding that intervention. And I am such a firm believer in democracy in this country. I'm such a firm believer in the empowerment of people at every level. As flawed as we may be in our ability to make and enable others to have the power to stand up for themselves, we've got to always keep trying to get it right. And to step in over the Northern Territory government a second time with a major intervention, not after what we've gone through. Not after what we've gone through after 15 years. Now, the legislation of the Stronger Futures was sunsetting. Not one word. In April last year, I asked the coalition government, and this is not to blame, this is just to put on the record, I asked the coalition government, what are you doing? You're going to remove, after 15 years, a system where people have been made to live under, rightly or wrongly, good or bad. How are you going to prepare them for the exiting? How are you going to prepare people for the fact that this legislation, once it ends, removes all of these things? What are you doing? And there was no response. And then we get into government. And did we move quick enough? Did we do the things that we needed to do? Goodness me, after nearly 10 years in opposition, there was a hell of a lot to learn in a couple of months coming in. And that's not an excuse, that's an explanation of the extraordinary amount of things we had to do. One of the first things that Marion Scrimgeour, Linda Burney and myself did, and Pat Dodson, was to urge the Northern Territory Government in August to please have a look at your legislation to ensure those bans are in place again. We did that. We did that in Garma, we did that on numerous phone calls. And of course we had so many other things to also do in that time period. Again, that's not an excuse, it's an explanation of timing. The Northern Territory Government can speak for itself, but I want to explain to the Senate why we have worked the way we have. Because there is no way, certainly Marion Scrimgeour and myself, would ever want to be setting up an intervention like occurred in 2007. But we will hold people accountable, irrespective of who is in government, as to how the process is occurring. To have Darrell Anderson as the regional controller in Central Australia, an incredibly articulate, intelligent woman who's got skills that go beyond all that we could imagine here in regards to those relationships with the language groups of that region, is the right person to have there. And it's her report last week that made the Northern Territory Government move to where it is today and enabled us as the federal government to provide the $250 million which we have announced for Alice Springs and Central Australia. But we also know, Senators, that it's not about just the alcohol, and it never really is. It's always about what are we doing to enable people in our regional remote areas to step up and stand up. We know that we have issues with health. We know that we have massive issues with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and we must invest in those areas even more so, to be able to work with the Alice Springs Hospital, to continue to work with Congress, which is the Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation in Alice Springs that is currently working on so many levels, but also with the FASD area. Absolutely vital that part of that $250 million goes to that, because the impact, and this Senate did an inquiry into FASD. Please, Senators, I urge you to read that inquiry that we took across the country and the reasons why we see our young people, and not just in Alice Springs, let me tell you, impacts our young people across the country. We talk about the issue of alcohol and other things impacting communities in Western Australia, in Queensland. Have a look at what FASD is doing in those areas. It is not isolated. We're also, as part of this, working with the families, again, on outstations with parental concerns. And so Darrell Anderson is working on a number of the outstations around Alice Springs to ensure we can take the families and work with them, specific families, because they can be identified by the Northern Territory Police as to which of the families that actually need this support. And on a more broader, holistic approach, we know that we have to get the employment program going in those communities surrounding Alice Springs. Yuendumu, Hermansburg, Papunya, Santa Teresa, Murrujulu, just to name a few. We know that part of this $250 million has to be about ensuring that community development program, where we're talking about jobs, actually means jobs. And we know now, even more so, that we have to see the runs on the board with that employment. So, Senators, in concluding, I ask you to see what the Northern Territory Government's doing. This has been a traumatic time for the people of Alice Springs and the families of Alice Springs and the businesses. But let me tell you, as Senator for the Northern Territory, there is a better way here, and we are doing the best that we can with that way. And I know you'll keep me accountable if that way does not work. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.